As usual, yes, I have to try and show why we could be pessimistic about sinus rhythm. I am naturally optimistic about it, but I think that as a community, we have not done very well in demonstrating that sinus rhythm is preferable to atrial fibrillation. Technically, I have to show you this slide about conflicts of interest. The slide gets busier and busier because people make you put more and more on it. I know you can't read it, and that's one of the purposes of putting so much on it, but please be aware of it. Let me start with the concept of what therapy we have which will allow us to maintain sinus rhythm or prevent atrial fibrillation. Roughly, they're divided into two concepts, antiarrhythmic drugs and non-drug therapy. Amongst the non-drug therapy, we could, of course, include lifestyle changes and so on, but basically it's drugs versus devices. We've had a whole host of antiarrhythmic drugs. They'll be discussed in detail by Stefan in a little while. We have some new drugs in the offing. We have also some new concepts about upstream therapy to maintain sinus rhythm. We have strategies that are concerned with reducing fibrosis. And of course, we've got the interesting speculation that NOAC drugs may in part prevent the development and progression of atrial fibrillation. We also have many potential ways of maintaining sinus rhythm using device-based therapies. And interestingly, there's a whole new development rethinking about automatic atrial defibrillators for atrial fibrillation. But I want you to read the bottom of the slide because it's very important. In order to convince regulators and to convince payers that new therapies are relevant and should be introduced, we have to do large-scale trials. We have to demonstrate reduction in harmful events such as mortality and stroke, and perhaps we can include hospitalizations within that. That's not the end of the story, of course. We have new European regulations in particular that are preventing the development of devices at the rate that we had before. And at the end of the story, we have to go through HTA's cost effectiveness and finally guidelines. So let's take a quick look at new antiarrhythmic drugs. I'm only showing one example. It's the small conductance calcium-activated potassium channel inhibitors. There are quite a few molecules with this particular action. Unfortunately, none of them is completely specific for this effect. It's a new drug target. It's a reasonable drug target. There's plenty of animal work demonstrating that it might be effective, but you see from this slide, it also prolongs the QT interval to some extent. Is that relevant? So we've got new drugs, but usually they're not particularly specific. We have a need to study them in great detail. And in this case, it's an intravenous drug and we need an oral drug to follow on therapy with it. Of course, we've got new ways of administering old drugs, and this puff in the pocket idea for flecainide is one that has been around for about 5 or 6 years. We know that it can be effective, and many of you in the audience may be involved in the dose-ranging studies that's going on with this particular formulation and method of delivering the drug right now. However, you can see from the device that it really won't fit in your back pocket. It might go in a handbag or a briefcase, but it's not really consistent with a modern lifestyle. It's taken a long time to get this far. We're about to go into phase 3 studies if the dose-ranging studies work out well, but it's taking time. There are new purposes for old drugs, and I think many of us have not understood the relevance of this sub-study from the BEST trial. you can see here that as far as the development of atrial fibrillation in patients with heart failure, that if you use bucindolol, you can delay the development of atrial fibrillation in panel A on the left. But you can see that that's entirely restricted to a particular genotype, the so-called beta-1 adrenergic receptor 389 arginine subtype, and not the arginine 389 glycine subtype. Now, the mechanism behind this is uncertain, but it's a clear difference. And unfortunately, of course, with old drugs, there are problems with their patent life. Major studies are needed, but there's a lack of investment because of the patent protection limitation, and there are limited returns from the development of drugs of this kind. Now, the Cubano study was raised, of course, by the previous speaker, and it is very relevant. He showed the ITT analysis, which, of course, is technically negative. He showed the per protocol analysis, which is just minimally significant, but you can see that there is a statistical difference between ablation and drugs. But I'd like you to see the bottom analysis, which is an as treated or treatment received analysis. You can see that the 2,200 patients, however, are distributed 1,300 with ablation and 900 with drug therapy. So the randomization in the trial is almost completely ignored. Unfortunately, we know no more about the similarity of these patient groups until we see the publication. By the way, the publication will be in 1 or 2 days from now, be published in JAMA. So we will at last have some more information about this study. But if you do this as treated analysis, and it's based on the concept that, of course, ablation cannot be helpful unless the patient is ablated, you see that there is a very significant reduction in the primary outcome and the secondary outcome of all-cause mortality, so, some 33 to 40% reduction. But is this really believable, since the randomization is no longer intact? So we have to ask ourselves why we have been unable to do these trials. It's taken a long time to recruit this trial, and the community, EP community must bear some responsibility for how long this has taken. We should have done this sort of trial with a couple of thousand patients undergoing ablation. It should have been done within a year or two in terms of recruitment, but it took many years. The endpoints had to be changed, and we have to regard it as a technically failed trial. But nonetheless, it's important, and it will have some influence on the use of ablation. Now, turning to the Castle AF trial, we can be negative about that trial too. You saw the results on the right with the Kaplan-Meier curves, a 38% relative risk reduction in the composite endpoint, but all-cause mortality was also reduced by 47%. It was a dramatic result. But if we look at the flow chart of patient flow through this trial, we can see that there are many potential problems. 3,000 patients screened, a little under 400 found suitable for randomization. Between randomization and getting an ablation procedure or going into follow-up, some 21 patients were excluded for ablation and 13 patients excluded for the conventional arm. If we look at the follow-up, we see 23 lost to follow-up in the ablation arm and 10 lost to follow-up in the conventional arm, and many crossovers. So this trial has been heavily criticized because of these findings. And again, we have to ask ourselves, why did it take so long to recruit these patients into this trial? Now, there are many, of course, new developments, technical developments within the ablation field. Many of them are still black boxes, or if not, complex mathematical equations, which is about the same for me. But nonetheless, the point I want to make about these developments, and this is the acutest development, is that these devices take a long time to develop, to introduce, and to satisfy regulators, and it's going to be particularly problematic with the new EU regulations as far as our getting our hands on this kind of equipment. So let me just summarize reasons for pessimism. Poor investment in cardiovascular medicine from pharma companies is very important. The lack of interest in antiarrhythmic drugs by pharma and investors. The fact that major trials are needed to demonstrate antifibrillation effects. And for long-term maintenance therapy, trials must assess irreversible harm. Trials are compulsory against placebo in both US and EU and against active comparators in the EU. Devices must be trialed to show technical and medical efficacy. Diagnostic devices are increasingly linked to improved outcomes. So a diagnostic device by itself, just being technically able, is no longer going to be a satisfactory way to introduce these devices. All trials are going to be larger and longer, more expensive, and done. They must be done before the lack or the loss of equipoise. Trialists and participants must be much more committed to ensuring that trials do not fail. And we have to think about HTA's cost-effectiveness studies, and they must also be, quote, positive. Finally, in order to get a therapy that the purchasers will be interested in, it has to be a Class 1A indication in guidelines. And getting into a guideline, as you see from these American regulations, you need multiple trials and meta-analyses for both the Class 1 and the Level A recommendation. So although I should say that I'm not necessarily a pessimist and an optimist, I prefer to be realistic, and in these terms, my glass is empty. I'd like a refill. Thank you very much.